Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodian of the land on which we meet today and pay my respect to their elder, past, and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I also pay my special respect to our fallen hero from Spring Revolution in Myanmar, and last not the least, to all our panel and participants from different parts of the world to join the AMI seminar today. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, May Chair. Well, the situation in Myanmar continues to be terrible, I'm afraid. And the people who are unhappily there at the moment, well, it's their country and we should all support the growth of the country, but life is terrible. And the wonderful thing is that we're able to have a thing like the Myanmar Campaign Network here in Australia, set up by APHEDA and run with wonderful people. And that helps to bring news from Myanmar to the attention of people in Australia and elsewhere in the world through the web. So we thought it would be a very good opportunity this time, at the end of October, to have a description of APHEDA and how the campaign network works. And then to hear from Michael Sainsbury about how journalists make use of how they obtain the information that they need for the stories they have to write, especially as most of the journalists now are necessarily outside Myanmar itself, but they maintain lots of connections. So let's start. Kate will speak first. She's from APHEDA and she can speak about this with an umbrella viewpoint about the way APHEDA functions and the way the campaign network was created. And then after that, Taz, as a Burmese member of the network, will speak about her role and the role of others like her, some of whom would have spoken tonight, except that they are naturally concerned about their own circumstances, should security people see who they are. And then Michael, as a working journalist who writes a lot of very good stuff about Myanmar in Crikey, will speak about the role of and position of journalists with this news. So, Kate, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you to AMI for the invitation to speak tonight. Really pleased to be here and pleased to be amongst friends and people that care about the situation in Myanmar and are committed to supporting the struggle there. I'd also like to start by acknowledging Aboriginal land. I'm coming to you from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders on this webinar and also acknowledge that sovereignty over this continent has never been ceded. So as Chris said, my name's Kate Lee. I'm the Executive Officer of Union Aid Abroad APHEDA, which is the global justice organisation of the Australian Union Movement. Our organisation was founded by the Australian Council of Trade Unions in 1984. And the ACTU, for those that don't know, is the peak body for unions across Australia. We're also accredited with DFAT and we're a registered charity. The advocates who established our organisation, just for a wee bit of background, were the ACTU president, a man called Cliff Dolan in the 1980s, and he was motivated by values of social justice and workers' justice. And the other was a young Australian nurse, Helen McHugh, who worked in the Palestinian refugee camps in Beirut in Lebanon, working alongside nurses who were caring for those after the horrors of the Shatila and Sabra massacres there in 1982. Helen was working alongside the Norwegian Trade Union Movement's organisation that had a humanitarian purpose. And this inspired her to think that Australian unions should also contribute in the humanitarian effort, particularly in support of refugees. So this commitment to refugees continued in the 1990s. And this is where our organisation began building connections with the Myanmar diaspora in Australia and on the Thai-Myanmar border following the military crackdown in 1988. And since the mid-1990s, APHEDA has supported organisations on the Thai-Myanmar border in relation to women's rights and development, social justice education, ethnic rights, healthcare, and independent media outlets. And as you all know, after 1988, until the election in 2012, the border regions were a critical hub for the pro-democracy movement and resistance to military rule. And that was led by the ethnic states, their political parties, and their armed forces. So after the election in 2012, trade unions became legal, and the international trade union movement reached out to help establish and support the formation of trade unions so that workers in the formal economy could organise for wage rises, improvements to the social wage, and begin a process to contribute to reducing inequality in society. In 2013, our organisation began working with some of the emerging labour rights organisations and the trade union movement in exile, known as the Federated Trade Unions of Burma, also regrouped inside the country, establishing an office with support from the international trade union movement. From 2016 to December 2021, so the end of last year, our organisation co-funded with the Dutch trade union movement a program of work supporting unions across the garment and manufacturing industries to organise at workplace level, township and provincial level, as well as working collaboratively across the union movement and with the Ministry of Labour in relation to minimum wages and labour law reform. We were in awe of the credible organising outcomes achieved by organised workers over the 9 years we worked alongside of those labour rights organisations. And no easy feat, given the highly restrictive nature of the labour laws introduced in Myanmar after the election there. These laws prevent workers from building power across the country without first stepping through multiple barriers to build local workplace unions and then at township level, sector by sector. It's quite an arduous process to organise formally under the labour laws, which I understand are still in place, even though, of course, people have not been able to effectively use them in the last 18 months. Of course, this work was interrupted by the coup in February last year. 18 labour rights organisations were deemed illegal early after the coup, and the leadership of the trade union movement was forced into exile or underground. Leaders of trade unions from workplace level right through to national level have been arrested or murdered. But despite this, we know that many continue to organise successfully underground in support of practical day-to-day workplace and wages issues, as well as in support of the CDM, the Civil Disobedience Movement. The International Trade Union Confederation, the global peak body of national unions, has consistently called for an end to the violence, an end to military rule, and the reinstatement of a civilian government, and has also called for the recognition of the National Unity Government and sanctions against the military. So moving on to the Myanmar Campaign Network. This is an Australian national coalition of human rights organisations, trade unions, aid organisations, Myanmar diaspora organisations and faith groups. And AMI, I'm pleased to say, is also a member of Myanmar Campaign Network. It was initiated in those early weeks by a number of us working together immediately following the coup, and we met weekly for about 6 months, monitoring the developments and coordinating our efforts with limited resources across our organisations. MCN, as it's known, now meets fortnightly, and we welcome new member organisations or individuals that want to contribute, including any of you here. MCN calls for the Australian government to, first of all, recognise the National Unity Government, and secondly, introduce targeted sanctions against military-owned entities and senior military leaders. And we note just yesterday, the former Foreign Minister, Gareth Evans, joined the call for sanctions. Further, MCN supports humanitarian assistance delivered through civil society, through the NUG, and through cross-border mechanisms. MCN fully supports the demands of the CDM as a true expression of the will of the people of Myanmar.
Don't hang up, I'll try and fix it later.
In March this year, we had secured pooled funds from trade unions, aid organisations and human rights organisations to employ a campaign manager for 6 months, and 2 women job share that role, one of whom you'll hear from tonight shortly, Tasneem Rock. In its short time thus far, MCN has achieved many outcomes, but we do need ongoing support for a second year, given the ongoing nature of the coup now. The extraordinary developments towards unity between ethnic groups, civil society and the NUG, as well as the full recognition by the NUG of the Rohingya genocide, has certainly made it much easier for Australian-based organisations to join together to provide full and unqualified support to the NUG and its demand for recognition. As difficult as unity is to maintain for the NUG and all of its member groups, winning against the military will only be possible with it. Continuing and growing solid support around the world from the international community also depends on this unity. Building internationalism in Australia beyond diaspora communities and the committed few requires resources and the support across the social movements in Australia, including the Labor movement. So how do we build the movement for Myanmar on par with the way in which the Australian social movements stood with the struggle for Timorese independence, for example, or against apartheid in South Africa? We need this level of broad Australian society support in order to really contribute along internationally with many around the world. Myanmar is a struggle of the same magnitude and, in my view, a winnable one. And full kudos to the Myanmar diaspora for being remarkably organised and determined this time around, certainly compared to 1988 and 2007. And I was part of the campaign in Australia after both of those flashpoints. We draw our inspiration, all of us, daily from the civil disobedience movement and the brave people of Myanmar who live under a daily threat to their lives. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, Kate. That's very good. I've put a note into the chat room saying that if anybody has any questions, please put them there. And what we do is to consolidate the questions when we get to question time so that it becomes easier for the panel to respond. But we move on now. And Taz, are you ready to tell us about the way you work with MCN and how you get it done?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone. It's a real delight to be here and to connect with AMI's audience. I'm calling in from Darug country here in Sydney, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I work in the campaign manager position with my colleague from Myanmar, as Chris said, who fled Myanmar shortly after the coup for her safety. And yes, keeping her identity safe is a security issue, which is why you are seeing me here and not her. And we do want to thank all of the individuals and organisations who have made our role possible. We're really delighted to be working under the auspices of Union Abroad APHEDA and to be able to contribute in a meaningful way to the cause. As Kate said, Myanmar Campaign Network formed very quickly after the February 1st coup last year. And it does, of course, contain Myanmar diaspora groups. So we have representatives from CRPH NUG Support Group Australia and Global Myanmar Spring Revolution. We're also very grateful that Dr. Tunong Shui, the National Unity Government representative to Australia, has always made himself very available to us. And MCN aims are informed by Myanmar diaspora groups and the National Unity Government. And so MCN supports the restoration of a civilian government and human rights in Myanmar. We do believe that Australia is perfectly positioned to take a leadership role in addressing the humanitarian and human rights crisis in Myanmar, both in terms of our national values of democracy and human rights and in our legislation as well. And most recently, I think we've all been shocked by the brutal missile attack on a music festival in Kachin State with a reported death toll of 80 people, with the military preventing the injured from accessing hospital care. And I think we were also all appalled by the hours-long attack by helicopter gunships on a school and village in Letyet Khon in Sagaing, which massacred at least 6 school children and injured 17 more. And this is the kind of brutality that is taking place all over the country, where the military is systematically targeting civilians with helicopter gunships, airstrikes and heavy artillery. And it's violence and repression that ethnic nationalities have experienced for the last 70 years. And I thought I'd talk a little bit about the two key aims that MCN has defined as ways that we as Australians can make a difference in the crisis that Kate had already mentioned. And that's recognition of the legitimate interim government, the national unity government, and also targeted sanctions. And I might just stop. Can everyone hear me okay? My sound's okay? Okay, perfect. So why are we looking at targeted sanctions as part of a solution to this crisis? So obviously after the February 1 coup, many democratic nations swiftly issued sanctions on Myanmar, our primary defense ally, the US, and our other democratic allies, the UK, EU, and Canada, have issued sanctions on over 196 individuals and over 172 entities, including business subsidiaries as of February this year. And there's a great fact sheet from the Australian Council for International Development that compares these sanctions to Australia's response. And I think Kate's just put a link to that in the chat. So further sanctions have been issued by our democratic allies since February, as you know. And so it's logical, isn't it, that Australia would join these nations in tough, fully coordinated, multilateral international action, but we have issued no new sanctions since the coup. We do have an arms embargo, and DFAT often cites the 5 individuals sanctioned in relation to the horrific crimes against the Rohingya, but they were issued in 2018 and they fall dramatically short of holding those responsible to account. Most notably, Min Aung Hlaing, who was Commander-in-Chief at the time of those atrocity crimes and instigated the 2021 coup, he's never been sanctioned by Australia. So why would sanctions be effective? And I think I'm preaching to the choir here, but as you know, the key reason for the outsized power of the Myanmar military is because of their vast business network. Obviously, that includes the 2 massive military conglomerates, Myanmar Economic Corporation, or MEC, and Myanmar Economic Holdings Limited, MEHL, which directly fund the military and are run by active and retired military leaders. And in fact, Justice for Myanmar, the anonymous human rights organisation, refers to the junta and its network of businesses as a cartel. And I think that's very accurate. And you may have seen their visualisation of this cartel. I think we've got a link to put in the chat if you haven't managed to see it, because it's quite fascinating. So we know the junta is desperate for foreign revenue. They have an estimated $6 billion of foreign revenue in their reserves. This year, they issued capital controls to restrict the outflow of foreign revenue. They've turned to natural resource extraction, leading to an increase in illegal logging and mining, and oil and gas companies continue to provide an estimated $1.5 billion each year. And revenue from this cartel is being used to purchase those arms, the heavy artillery, the jets and aviation fuel used in the systematic attacks against civilians. So this is our case, and I think it's a very clear case that sanctioning these business entities and cutting off foreign revenue to the junta will help restore peace, democracy and human rights in Myanmar. We've always been able to sanction Myanmar since the coup under our Anonymous Sanctions Act. You will remember last year we weren't able to sanction entities under the existing act, and that changed in March of this year with regulations introduced to increase the scope of sanctions targets. So that increases the scopes of individuals who can be targeted, individuals who can be sanctioned, individual bodies and political parties, and also entities. So we can sanction those military conglomerates and their subsidiaries. Obviously, last year as well, in December, the Magnitsky-style laws were introduced, but they could be used, but we can use our existing Autonomous Sanctions Act as it is. Another important thing that I wanted to talk about was we are calling for targeted sanctions on Myanmar state-owned enterprises. Obviously, if Myanmar was a peaceful democratic nation, these enterprises would be earning revenue for the country of Myanmar. But since the coup, those bank accounts are under the control of the junta. And I'd like to give an example of how sanctions have actually worked in the case of the state-owned enterprise, Myanmar Oil and Gas Enterprise, or MOGE, or MOGE, or MOGE, it depends. I've heard it said lots of different ways. So in February this year, the EU sanctioned MOGE, and that has led to the Bank of China to advise the operators of the Shui oil and gas field, which is in northwestern Myanmar, that it will not handle payments in euros to MOGE, and euro payments to MOGE are being kept in escrow accounts, and there has been no interruption to the actual operation of that gas field. There is a global campaign to sanction MOGE, and if you would like to sign the petition that's been organised, we'll put that link in the chat as well. So while other countries, such as the US, are debating more effective sanctions, such as on MOGE, Australia is still yet to issue any sanctions. We do know that there's strong cross-party support for targeted sanctions. Labor was a very vocal advocate of sanctions prior to the election. And it's what the people of Myanmar have been calling for. And when you look inside the country, people are effectively sanctioning the junta internally by refusing to pay taxes, refusing to pay electricity bills. People are still participating in the civil disobedience movement, refusing to work under military rule. Although Indonesia and Malaysia have mentioned sanctions, it's fairly unlikely that ASEAN nations are going to issue sanctions given their mandate of non-interference. So Australia is uniquely placed in terms of our legislation and in terms of our democratic principles to issue sanctions. It's a pretty good segue here to mention the failure of the ASEAN 5-point consensus. Frustration obviously has been building within ASEAN for some time, with Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore becoming increasingly outspoken in their criticism. But in this environment, Australia can't reasonably be looking for an ASEAN-led solution. That's our belief. So just turning to the second aim, which is recognition of the national unity government. And the flip side of that is also the unconstitutionality and the illegitimacy of the junta. I think it's really important to remember that the junta did not expect the president to refuse to sign a state of emergency. In detaining him and placing the deputy president as their acting president and declaring a state of emergency, they violated the country's 2008 constitution, which makes any claims to power unconstitutional, illegal, and illegitimate. Obviously they are planning elections for 2023. The people of Myanmar have already voted in free and fair elections in 2020, and the will of the people was, by over 80% of votes, is for the National League for Democracy. The elections in 2023 can't possibly be free and fair, as they've locked up the majority of leaders and the party members of one party to hold an election. The election would take place in a relatively small part of the country under military control. The Union Election Commission would be filled with their loyal ex-military people, and there would be no international election watch organisations. The important thing to remember is that cementing military rule will do nothing to end the conflict in Myanmar and the deep-seated issues that are in Myanmar. It will escalate and extend the conflict and devastate the country even further. And everyone deserves to exercise their democratic rights in peace without fear of violence or persecution, and the junta is denying the people their democratic voice. In contrast, shortly after the coup, 3 legitimate interim institutions have emerged: the National Unity Government, the NUG, the Committee representing Pridonsu Luto, the CRPH, and the National Unity Consultative Council, the NUCC. And these are the most diverse and inclusive and representative setup of institutions that Myanmar has ever seen. As Kate mentioned before, the NUG issued a historic statement in June of last year on its intentions to comply with international obligations regarding to the Rohingya, including voluntary, safe and dignified repatriations. And this would never be possible under the military junta. I won't go on for too much further. I will note that there has been an increase in humanitarian aid for Myanmar in the new budget, from 95.5 million to 120.6 million. And we are assured, of course, that this money will be distributed through trusted partners and will not reach the junta, but we do urge Australia to distribute aid through cross-border mechanisms and to engage with the NUG and local partners in the distribution of that aid. Also to note that since 2015, there's been dramatic defunding of programs on the border in regards to education and healthcare, and that aid would be very well spent to refund those projects for midterm solutions, looking towards building infrastructure for voluntary return. So yeah, I guess to conclude, there's an amazing opportunity now for Australia to participate in this democratic transition, and that the call from the people of Myanmar and the Myanmar diaspora is action now, no more statements. And we thoroughly support that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Taz. That's really interesting. And now, before calling on Michael, I might just say that in the matter of sanctions in Australia, a member of parliament for whom we have a lot of respect and who we meet from time to time is Zoe Daniel, the new independent member for Goldstein, which is a Melbourne electorate. She gave notice of motion just before about a week ago in the parliament, calling for the imposition by Australia of targeted sanctions against the Myanmar junta to isolate it and its supporters from access to international funds and resources. When she put this forward, she said in the notice of motion that the United States, the United Kingdom, the EU, India, and Canada have imposed sanctions on more than 196 individuals and 172 business entities associated with the junta. Now, as Taz has said, Australia has done nothing on sanctions since the sanctions imposed on a few people in the wake of the Rohingya crisis. So it's a good call. Thank you for that, Taz. Now we move on to Michael, who will speak as a working journalist about the way they gather the information that they need, he and his colleagues, to report on the situation. And I must say that the situation that we see in those reports is terrible. It's a shocking situation. And it's a great credit to the journalists that they're able to get any information at all which they can bring to the Australian public. It's just a pity that the major organisations in Australia don't give it more attention. Michael.
Yeah, I would second that, Chris, that the mainstream media doesn't give it as much attention as it should. Amanda Hodge at The Australian is probably the best example of someone that manages to get stories in the paper. And indeed, she had the interview with Gareth Evans a couple of days ago. And I just wanted to make a comment on that point that he made about the fact that it's this soft pedal diplomacy, behind the scenes diplomacy that Australia has been trying in relation to Sean Turnell, who many of us know and who's been locked up since pretty much straight after the coup and has now been sentenced to some years in jail. It's a very similar situation. I was based in China for 4 years and watched quite a few Australian Chinese people being detained and locked up by the communist government, authoritarian government in China. There was a lot of soft pedal diplomacy that went on in the background. None of it ever worked. We were always deeply critical of DFAT for trying to block, I suppose, Australian media, such as it was in China in those days. At least there was a few Australian media representatives. There are none now. It's the same thing in Myanmar. These authoritarian regimes don't. It's worth a try at the beginning, I think, and I think Gareth Evans was right, and Kate's right, and Tasneem's right in saying that the time for talking is over. Penny Wong's made plenty of talk about imposing some sanctions, so I think they should get around to that pretty damn soon. And again, I suppose in many ways the situation in Myanmar is a little bit similar these days to the situation that we do have in China. After all the Australian correspondents left China a couple of years ago, the authoritarian regime up there has become tougher. As we know, it's nothing like as just dramatic as it is in Myanmar, however. From my point of view, my background is I first went to Myanmar 21 years ago, end of 2001. So I did get to see the country in its previous dark days. There wasn't as much open civil war going on there. It was much more scattered around the edges and tourists couldn't get anywhere near around the edges then. After I was in China, I went to live in Bangkok and work in Bangkok in 2013. I covered the 2015, I've got hoping the years wrong, 2015 election when Aung San Suu Kyi surged to power, and that was a particularly interesting couple of years going back and forth from Bangkok to Myanmar. I got to know the country very, very well. I've been up to all around the country, really. I've been to refugee camps in Kachin and Shan State. I've been to refugee camps in Rakhine State with the first of the Rohingyas before the mass exodus a couple of 2 or 3 years after that. I think the first riots, Rohingya riots, were in 2012. So having had a lot of experience in the country is very helpful, trying to write about a conflict that you can't actually access directly. I mean, it would not be safe for me or any journalist who's ever written anything about the junta to even try and get into the country. And I'm probably too old. If I was 25, I might give it a go. But you know, that makes it much more difficult to be able to talk to people on the ground. A lot of people I know from my time working there and visiting there, and indeed we had actually moved there not long before the COVID outbreak hit. So I was looking forward to covering the election, and none of that ever happened because I got stuck in Australia. But a lot of people I know over there can't communicate with me because it's just not safe to get on social media. There's obviously a few avenues that we have through more encrypted social media platforms like Signal and Telegram, where some people are happy to speak. But most of the information, we really rely on aid agencies and their contacts, particularly the UN's Humanitarian Affairs Office, which puts out a monthly update on the conflict in Myanmar and indeed other places. Human Rights Watch has always been very good. There's Fortified Rights, and there's a number of other aid organisations who do have people on the ground. And if you work hard enough, you can get some good stories out. I think it was worth noting that the ABC, I think, did a terrific job maybe last month or the month before, when they had 2 very good reports, one on Four Corners, which was a very nice summary of what had happened since the coup, and they had worked with a lot of very brave journalists on the ground there, and gathered some terrific footage. I thought that report was very good. And there was also a report on Foreign Correspondent where they came over the border into Chin State from India. Again, brave work but necessary work. And there are journalists, at the well-funded organisations like BBC and Al Jazeera who are still trying to do some of that work. In terms of, I suppose, journalists on the ground, everybody probably knows that the junta has really cracked down on local journalists, and there seems to be a very, very disturbing trend of locking journalists up and indeed probably torturing them, and I would not be surprised if some of them ended up in the firing line. They've made it pretty clear that they've made it pretty clear that they don't have a problem with sullying their reputation by killing prisoners. So it's a tough situation for journalists and trying to report on it. There's obviously some very good publications that come from inside the country. Frontier Myanmar is a particularly good resource, as everybody would know, I imagine, and I would encourage everyone to keep supporting those journalists financially, because they really are at the front line of writing the stories about what's happening inside the country. The Irrawaddy and some of those other newsletters have been around for quite a while. All of that information is really useful and helpful to people like me who don't get a chance to write as much about Myanmar as we want to, but when we do, there are some very good credible sources that we can at least lean on. Very upsetting that we can't get in there to talk to people. I suppose we'll just continue to soldier on.
Well, sorry, you were going to say something else?
No, that's it, man. Happy to take it.
That's very good of you. You finished just in time for us to be able to have a reasonably good session with questions and answers. And we have quite a few questions that have come in already. and please put more in when you have them. One of the questions has already been answered in the chat room by Taz. It's from John Askob, who wants to know whether the sanctions should target family members and cronies of those who are, of the individuals who themselves are targeted. Would you like to expand on that, Taz? When you say, your answer said immediate family members, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so the provision in our Autonomous Sanctions Act, which I don't have in front of me right now, there is a provision that to sanction individuals and their immediate family members. So you would presume that they would be family members who are also benefiting from, you know, the ill-gotten gains of the junta. Yeah. So yes, we do support that, and I apologize that I didn't talk about sanctioning individuals, but yes, we definitely support the sanctioning of individuals and immediate family members. And also interesting to note that in terms of the diaspora, there is concern about family members of the junta who are in Australia. I think they've identified at least 15 who are living in Australia, some of whom are doctors, and certainly the medical professionals here are very concerned that there are people practicing medicine here who most likely got their education here, funded by atrocity crimes. So that's something to point out anyway.
Okay, thank you for that. Looking at the questions, there's a lot of, I should note that a lot of links have been put into the chat page. Madam Chair is going to extract all these links and put them onto a piece of paper so that when she circulates the video of this to everybody, then you will have all those there. So you don't have to copy them all off now. If you can wait for a few more days, you'll be able to have the links from that and check them. But we'll also get for you a link to Frontier Myanmar, because one of the other questions was how do we get to Frontier Myanmar? I can say I get to Frontier Myanmar by getting it in my regular email, and I've registered myself with them, and that works out very well. I have a question about the network, Taz, and also for you, Kate. I'm not sure how. Kate, APHEDA is the registered NGO, is that right? To which contributions or donations are made. And from that funding, you support MCN, or does MCN have a registration of its own, to which donations can be made?
Thanks, Chris. Yes, because Myanmar Campaign Network sprung up after the coup, we were focused on, activity and trying to influence Australian government policy. So people didn't put the work into forming an organisation as such. And of course, everybody is hopeful that particularly in those early months, that the coup might not last as long as it has. So in the second half of last year, we undertook to try and seek donations to be able to employ a campaign manager to be able to assist the work of Myanmar Campaign Network, because of obviously, there's a lot that can be done. And so our organisation as a registered charity has accepted a range of donations from other organisations in order to effectively, all of the resources go towards employing a full-time campaign manager, plus a small budget for some travel and other expenses. But effectively, it's really not very big. And yes, people can, if they want to, they can donate to our organisation. They can make a lump sum donation towards Myanmar Campaign Network, or they can donate monthly if they wish, in order that goes to the designated, we've got a designated fund there for the Myanmar Campaign Network. It was felt that obviously if you're going to employ someone, they need to be under the structure of another organisation, and Myanmar Campaign Network is not a registered organisation in Australia. Thanks.
Thank you. That's a similar condition to the way that AMI works. We don't have our own separate tax deductibility registration under the gift recipient label, but we're very grateful to Global Reconciliation for being the parent organisation for us for these tax deductibility purposes. So I understand what you're saying. But can you please give us something which we can add to the video when we put out our report on this meeting, so that people know how to make a donation to support this work. That would be very handy.
Yes, of course, can provide that.
Okay. Now, it's pointed out by another of our wonderful audience that the Irrawaddy has a paid subscription page, which makes it possible to support journalists through that news magazine as well. There are quite a lot, actually, which carry material about Myanmar, but not all of them have direct links to Myanmar itself, and they work off gossip to produce their news. And one of the good things about Frontier Myanmar and the Irrawaddy is they both use people who are there on the spot and providing material, which gives people like us, and I see Michael nodding, gives us the ability to use material which comes directly from there and is not generated by, if you like, best wishes from somewhere else in the world. There's a question from Louise Sutherland. Is that how I pronounce your name, Louise?
Yes, that's right, thanks.
The camps on the Thai-Myanmar border, which were previously very large, are they full again with displaced people? In which ways can we support them? Well, AMI provides some support to those camps from donations which we receive for that purpose. But who can now say a little bit more about that?
My understanding was that Thailand wasn't taking any more refugees, and in fact was actively pushing back refugees. In terms of how you might be able to help, certainly one of APHEDA's partners, the Korean Women's Organization, has a lot to do with the camps. Kate, do you want to say a little bit more about KWO and the work that they've done?
Yes, sure. Yes, just adding on from Taz's comments there. We've had a long relationship with the Korean Women's Organization, which some of you probably know. They are active in providing services throughout the camps for Korean women, children and families. They're also sort of strong advocates on a range of things, including they've had a strong background in advocating against sexual violence by the military, for example, in Karen State, but on many other issues. I can't give you an exact up-to-date update, I'm sorry, Louise, on from information from them. But again, we can get an update from them on the situation as they see it. And most certainly, I mean, for those of many of you would know, Nor Kinyorpor, who is the head of that organisation, an amazing woman that leads that organisation. They provide services throughout the camp, but they also train their cohort of members in leadership skills and abilities. So they're quite admirable and amazing in that way. I can also provide a link. Again, if people wanted to donate regularly to the camps through the Korean Women's Organisation, they can do that through us. I can provide the link in the email that goes out.
If I could just add a little bit to that, I had a conversation with someone about this a couple of weeks ago. The camps on the Thai border with Myanmar, and I've been up there when I lived in Thailand, very, very well established to the point where they're almost sort of towns. A lot of people, when they had the chance to go back to Myanmar, didn't want to go back. There was a process of people repatriating for a while, but those borders up there, like all borders in Myanmar, are very porous. And while the Thai government's definitely had it playing a much harder line this time, and a lot of that is because it has very big economic vested interests in Myanmar, probably second only to China. So the militaries, there is definitely a connection between the two militaries. The Thais won't want this happening on their border, but they're not going to. They're very ambivalent about joining any noise against the junta at all. But as I said, those borders are porous, and people will continue to get through, albeit it's a much less safe process than it may have been if the Thais were remotely humane.
There's been a question put in by Joanna Garnett about the closure of the newspaper, the Irrawaddy. And I'm going to put a link into this chat room about that so that you can read the story yourself. It would appear that the Irrawaddy doesn't take this lying down. They will continue to exist. They point out in that a number of their most useful people are already in jail. And so that's just one of those things we have to keep in mind. Myanmar has got a terrible record for the treatment of journalists in the country. It's one of the most restrictive and repressive countries in the world in handling journalists. And that's one of the reasons why it's such a great thing for us in Australia and for people in the rest of the world that there's a network like MCN, which can bring news out that people can rely on when they see it. And one of the things that Taz hasn't said is that she and her colleagues work quite hard to make sure that what they put out is not just rumor-based, but there's a decent evidence fact-based for what they send out so that people can rely on what they see. And there are other organizations, and I can think of one in the UK right now, but I won't name it, where you see the stuff and it just looks like propaganda. MCN doesn't do that. They produce well-based, well-founded material for us all to use. And I am very grateful to Kate and APHEDA for the support that they've given to building MCN to be the organization that it is. Kate, you mentioned AMI with MCN, and John Brukel, who was with us at the start, but I think is not now because he's catching a plane. No, he's still here. Work closely together. We don't sign everything that MCN produces, despite the fact that might look good, because we don't want to go beyond our narrow mandate, which until our AGM yesterday was really restricted to supporting Myanmar in the pursuit of its sustainable development goals. But it's now obvious, and Kate referred to the length of time this outfit's been in power, the military. It's now obvious that things aren't going to turn good in a hurry. So we are notifying Consumer Affairs Victoria, with whom we're registered, that the thing we're going to have to concentrate on in order to get back to our original objectives is the restoration of democracy and the rule of law. Anyway, that's the way that runs now. So you can see the link to the Irrawaddy that I've posted there today, just now. Kate's posted a link to how to make a donation. And there's a question from John Askov. It's really a question that we all think about. If you're in Myanmar, you can be rightly very worried and concerned about the likelihood that military intelligence or state security will be watching you and taking notes on everything you do and arresting you if they feel like it. The question of whether there are people in Australia who do the same sorts of reporting back home is a fair one. And there may be people who don't themselves form part of a pro-junta cohort, to use John Askov's words, but who have family and relatives at home who are terrorized to the point that they have no choice but to do some reporting. Taz, are you able to say anything about this as it affects your work?
I think that, well, I mean, the very fact that my colleague can't be seen on the Zoom, you know, we do have a genuine concern about this kind of thing. It's a little hard to identify, like you said. You know, if you're in Myanmar, it's very obvious. You know, if you're being surveilled, you'll be picked up. You know, you'll be detained, that sort of thing. You know, I think that the diaspora here, there's always sort of an underlying concern about, you know, whether there are spies, legitimately so. And, you know, there's been lots of claims of foreign interference from other communities like Cambodia and Laos. And it's very reasonable to think that there's a similar thing happening here as well. Yeah. Yeah. So that's my, yeah. And there has been a couple of incidences of threats being made on social media and by phone, that sort of thing as well. So it does exist.
I might take this question to another member of the diaspora, and this time look across the continent. Dr. Thette, you're in Perth, is that right? No, unmute yourself. You have to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I'm in Rockhampton, Central Queensland.
Oh, you're in Rockhampton, I'm sorry. Well, that's across the continent too.
Yeah.
do you feel, as a member of the diaspora, do you feel that you and other people are under any kind of surveillance in Australia?
I'm pretty sure, because still the embassy is occupied by the military junta. I think the main duty is they have to spy on all the Myanmar diaspora here, and also probably Australian government, and as well, what's happening here. I'm pretty sure that there will be, report every day out going to Rangoon of what's happening here. However, I think, the infiltration, across the Myanmar diaspora here, I don't think there are many, because I think all of us are pretty vigilant about that. So I think it's really, I think, right to say that there will be many watching us, but not at a probably deeper level.
But I guess if there were students in Australia who had come from Myanmar and were under pressure from home to report on the activities of other students here, then that would be very difficult to control. That wouldn't be dealing with people who are long-term residents of Australia like yourself, but it'd be dealing with the people who are short-term or something in Australia and who have parents or other close relatives back home that might be subject to a problem.
Yeah.
You'll see more, everybody, of Dr. Thette and Dr. Raymond Tintway, who's here, and Louise Newman, who's not here, next month at the end of November, when they will be speaking about trauma in Myanmar and what's happened to the population as a consequence of the military takeover and the acceleration of conflict in the country. And this has a part of that. So trauma is not only for the people who are actually physically in Myanmar, it can affect the people who are outside, like members of the diaspora here. And I think it's very reassuring for those people who are here. There's a body like MCN, which is helping to bring together news and information and organize campaigns and petitions on their behalf. Are there any other questions? We seem to be close to the end of questions. Oh, Thette, you asked another question about MCN. Would it work with the ethnic revolutionary organizations?
Yeah.
And Kate, do you work with those organizations?
Thank you so much for your question, Dr. Thette. So we are not in direct contact with any EROs. So the interactions that we've had have been mostly with civil society organizations, NGOs, and obviously with members of the National Unity Government. And obviously in the National Unity Consultative Council, there are EROs represented, as are the civil disobedience movement leaders, strike committee leaders, that sort of thing. But our interaction has been more in terms of interacting with the ministers and that sort of thing, and also interacting with the National Unity representative to Australia, Dr. Tonon Shui. Do you have any information or any advice in regards to that, though? I'm curious.
Yes, thank you for that. I think that's absolutely on the right track, and yeah, communicating with NUG, CRBH is the right way. But like you rightly said, that the ERO are very much I would say embedded and enmeshed with particularly NUCC. So National, Consultative Council, and all together there are many ethnic, representative from ERO in NUCC. So I think, I think it's a right to think when you mention about NUG, CRBH, and NUCC, they are the right bodies to contact, and automatically the ERO rep will be there. And the other thing, my advice would be, it would be really good to, walk and liaise and hear and feel from the people on the ground. And I'm pretty sure you're doing that as well.
We're very lucky that we have had the opportunity to have that kind of dialogue and we with people on the ground as well. And we want to continue that as well. Yes.
This persuades me to offer an observation, and then we will close because we will have run out of time. I teach a course to students all around the world on humanitarian diplomacy. And one of the things that we feature in that course is how to conduct a negotiation with a non-state armed group. A non-state armed group is commonly believed to be a bunch of rebels, or perhaps Boko Haram or whoever, those sorts of people. In the case of Myanmar, non-state armed groups have until recently been generally believed to be rebels, fighting, say, the Karen or whoever, the Mon, the AA, fighting against the central government. Things have changed a lot in perception, and I've been trying to underline this to the people on this course and make them think about it. When you have a government which, because of the way it attained power, has become an illegitimate government, if it's a government at all, then what is the ethnic armed group? Is it a rebel group, or is it, because it's associated with the democratically elected NUG and the CRPH within the People's Defence Force and those things? What is the status of this? And I've got these students thinking about what we should be considering with respect to these organizations in Myanmar. The Global Terrorism Index, which is published by an international grouping based in Sydney, but with tentacles all over the world, produced its terrorism index in which they labeled Myanmar as one of the hotbeds of world terrorism because of the activities of the non-state armed groups. And I and a bunch of other people, headed by Nick Cheeseman from ANU and some others, have taken these people to task and said, what are you talking about? First of all, your definition of this of terrorism is wrong. And secondly, if you apply terrorism as a label to the non-state armed groups in Myanmar, you're forgetting that the principal terrorists in the country are in fact the military. And the things that you've said, Taz and Kate, about bombing villages, the death toll from the actions that they've taken is beyond description. That's where the terrorism lies, not with the non-state armed groups. And so we have to reverse all that. And that then makes me think that we in AMI, and perhaps this applies to MCN as well, have to think about having a stronger relationship with the NUG's Ministry of Defence, not necessarily with the armed groups themselves, but with this Ministry of Defence, which provides a form of umbrella for the work they do. And then from that help to provide Michael and others with the kind of base material that they could use in reporting the conflict. It's a difficult thing to work out. And there's some very fine lines to cross, and they're not lines that the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade wants to go anywhere near at the moment, but we're going to have to get there if we're going to work anything out. I thought that one of the things that was said by Gareth Evans, if I remember correctly what he said, and I haven't looked back in the last hour at the things he actually said, was that he was looking at the NUG without using the word recognition, but confirming the authority, or words to that effect, of the NUG. And those are words we're going to have to use as we think about how we in AMI need to work and what we need to tell DFAT and Minister Wong about what they should do. But I firmly believe that we have to carry Minister Wong forward with what she wants to do. And we have to look at reasons why we look at ways that we can go forward without jeopardizing the life and limb of Sean Turnell in particular. Are there any last comments that anyone would like to make? And Kate, do you want to say anything, or Taz or Michael, before we round out the hour? Kate?
No, not for me. Thank you.
Taz?
Oh, that was very interesting what you just said, Chris. I was just going to say there is precedence for recognition in terms of recognising the NUG, that the EU Parliament recognised the NUG last October, and as did the French Senate. But yes, totally agree that we should be calling for high level public engagement with the NUG from our Foreign Minister. Yeah.
Well, on that, I should say that a parliament can't recognise a foreign government. A government recognises a government, not a parliament. A parliament works with or recognises a foreign parliament. The Australian Parliament, including under the last government, established a working relationship with the CRPH as the replacement for the parliament, the Pidang Zuglutor. It's the committee representing the Pidang Zuglutor. The Australians also, together with other parliaments, defended the right of the CRPH to sit in the Myanmar seat at the Interparliamentary Union. Now, that was relatively easy to do because the military don't have a parliament that can come along and pretend to sit in the seat. But still, the relationship between parliament and parliament is a strong one that we must protect. And from what I can understand, talking to the members of parliament now, they agree with that. And we've maintained quite a good working relationship with people like Senator David Fawcett, who's a Liberal from South Australia, who chaired the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade in the last parliament, and who remains very actively interested in Myanmar and made quite a good speech about Myanmar last week in the Senate, and other members of the parliament from all parties, and they all agree that we should continue to maintain this parliament-to-parliament relationship. What we have to do government to government, it won't go to recognition because Australia doesn't recognise foreign governments, it recognises states, but it works with authorities. What the Australians need to do is to say publicly that there are large parts of Myanmar and many functions within Myanmar which are not subject to the control of the Min Aung Hlaing junta, and have a working relationship, a public working relationship with the NUG. So we have to work out exactly the right language to use on this so that there's no challenge to that from people who might want to play games with us.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you.
Okay, Finley McRae is asking questions. CRPH, Taz has answered that. Your question about the earth minerals?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that if it's possible through union work to connect with people who can put pressure on Japan, Japan is an absolutely critical connector for Myanmar. And I know that they've reduced aid, and someone else mentioned that, but in terms of, because China will not sell rare earth minerals to Japan, and they desperately need them for their electronics industries, and they get most of them from Myanmar, which has huge supplies. And I think that there should be pressure placed on Japan to do better in relation to its sanctions. That's all I wanted to say. I mean, obviously we're focused on Australia and that's our priority, but I think we should work globally as well.
Well, it's a fair point. Australia is a member of the much vaunted Quad, which has Japan as one of its members. And so we should have a close enough relationship with Japan on regional issues, including Myanmar, that we can speak to them about this. So let's see. Okay, we are over the hour. Are there any final points anyone would like to make? Otherwise, I thank the speakers very much. I thank you, Kate. I thank you, Taz. I thank you, Michael. And I'm glad that we heard a little bit from you, Dr. Thete, because you and Raymond and Louise Newman will be speaking at the end of November on trauma. So thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you again.